We can pick from 50 different states. We sacrificed all for the sake of truth. Dyer was seen by viewers for a long time as an example of truth and faith. However, what if all your beliefs were based on hidden truths? Jonilamb shockingly admits he has finally broken his stillness, exposing the truth of what transpired behind closed doors. Millions vanished without a trace. Who was controlling everything? Why was the reality kept under wraps for a long time? This goes beyond a mere financial controversy. A worldwide ministry is rocked to its very core by this treachery. The obvious choice to succeed Dyer has always been Jonilamb. His lineage extended beyond that of Marcus Lamb. His family's Christian media empire was worth billions of dollars. It was common knowledge throughout the ministry. It wasn't some idle speculation or gossip. It was a formality. Documentation, signatures, and seals had been placed on the leadership plan. After his father's death, Jonathan was to succeed him as president of Dyer. It was definitely happening. It had been a long-term goal all along. Jonathan was never one to watch from the sidelines when he was a kid. He was actively involved, gaining a foundational understanding of everything. In addition to preaching, hosting, and team leading, played a supporting role. He was being ready to take up the torch, step by step. People looked up to him and his reputation was solid. From the outside looking in, the way seemed clear. Marcus had constructed a huge structure and now Jonathan was going to carry on the family name. It was a leadership style known as legacy, which involves passing on responsibilities, trust, power, and wealth from one generation to the next. Everyone thought Jonathan would take over for his father, Marcus, once he died in 2021. And for a split second, it appeared as though that was precise nature of the event. Vice president was bestowed upon Jonathan. Susie, his wife, also played a more significant part. Their pay was raised. They became more influential within the ministry. Upon first glance, all was starting to fit together. They were now fulfilling the roles for which they had trained and been promised. However, behind the scenes, an uneasy feeling persisted. Jonathan wasn't merely inheriting a title, which was something that most people didn't know. Entering a system was his next move, and that system was accompanied by both explicit and implicit expectations. Being invited to lead wasn't the only thing. Someone had instructed him to safeguard a meticulously constructed reputation. When circumstances weren't right, it was necessary to remain silent. As a result, difficult discussions were sidestepped. So, it was necessary to comply with decisions. Anything he felt uneasy about in order to maintain harmony. During that period, we were better prepared than before. When I was wrestling with it, I would implore God, when will Jonathan be ready? Back at home, he felt the weight of it all. He was. And Susie would have those late-night conversations, probing queries. It wasn't anger. They carried a heavy load, not animosity. It became clear to them that Jonathan was being called to lead for more than just that. He was being asked to make a decision. Which would he choose? The one that was already set out for him or the one that God felt pulling him toward? Everything appeared to be going swimmingly, the income, the power, the platform, but that was when the true anxiety started to build. But a profound disquiet existed on the inside. Leading Dyer would require sacrifice on Jonathan's part, and he wasn't sure he could do it. For all he knew, ascending to that throne may include abandoning his own identity. And that insight rocked him to his very being. The job was no longer the only thing that mattered. It centered on morality. Faith was at the center. Obeying was less important than leaving a lasting impact. It was not a simple decision. When something good comes your way, why would you turn it down? Who would dare to relinquish a title that many would aspire to? However, Jonathan and Susie had other plans. They sought tranquility. Pretending didn't provide them any relief either. They lost the ability to smile. Filming while feeling slightly weak on the inside. Not out of a lack of concern, but out of an excess of care, they quietly and radically decided to withdraw. Despite written promises to the contrary, they abandoned the future. The position was one for which most people would battle, and the name was well respected in Christian communities all across the globe. Not because they wanted to make a statement, but because they were unable to live a lie. Truth, not even a throne, could be exchanged for titles. They stepped into something even more extraordinary by rejecting the anticipated. Liberation, harmony. Harmonious relationship, and that is the strength of their narrative. The chance was enormous because the throne was genuine. If Jonathan's soul was going to be sacrificed for it, then it was not worth it. The succession failed because of this. This is not due to his failure, but rather his decision. A superior option. It was not in the midst of a storm that Jonathan and Susie Lamb escaped dire. No dramatic incident, angry social media post, or tell-all interview occurred, and there was no explosive fight. As far as the eye could tell, it was unusually silent. However, what the majority of individuals failed to see was that their departure was not an impulsive decision. Wrestling, praying, doubting, crying, and listening for months, if not years, went into it. I didn't have a breakdown. A gradual, inwardly focused defiance ensued. On the side of individuals, but in defiance of a system that had become incompatible with their values. Jonathan had already been assured of everything. Even before his father, Marcus Lamb, died, he had officially begun his rise to power. Jonathan assumed the position of vice president upon Marcus's death. President was the next logical step after becoming president. There was a written plan for everything. Not only that, but his wife Susie stepped up to the plate and started making more money. There was consistency in their lives, which had never been before. Get out of debt once and for all. There is no longer any need to struggle to support a family on a variable wage. They were well respected, had titles, were well known, and had a plan for the future. But nonetheless, something began to fall apart on the inside. It started out as little apprehensions, questions, and it persisted. Unsettling decisions being made in private. In meetings where candor was valued less than quiet. As they progressed through the ranks of leadership, they came to see how the system was based on maintaining a certain image at the expense of confronting unpleasant realities. The ministry wasn't the only thing Jonathan was supposed to head. It was expected that he would ensure the machine ran smoothly. Keep smiling, keep performing, and keep the legacy safe. Do not cause waves or public doubt. But the weight of that legacy began to weigh on me. Not constructed, solely based on trust anymore. Secret politics, media censorship, and power were its foundations. Jonathan and Susie found it increasingly difficult to remain calm in the face of the unfolding events. Not wanting to start a confrontation, but also not wanting to lie to. On their own. They hadn't bargained for this, and it was certainly not something they wanted to leave to future generations. Jonathan would sit down with Susie late at night, after the meetings had ended and the cameras had turned off, and ask her the same hurtful questions again and over. Is this the correct course of action? Can we be trusted? Or are we merely trying to avoid conflict by remaining silent? They were shattered in those moments. Not external pressure, but internal strife. Staying put and attempting to make changes from within was the thinking of some. Ultimately, they possessed the authority, sway, and esteem. It would be better if you just took charge and guided Dyer on the right path. However, they couldn't simply tweak the system, that was the truth. It demanded their whole attention to a cause they no longer held. Constant giving in would have been required if I stayed. When it came to matters of the heart as well as the intellect, nothing they tried would work. No matter the cost, in terms of money, status, or legacy, it is not worth it. They were not praised for their choice to depart. It was terrifying. The loss was inevitable. Everything shifted the second they stopped talking. The assured income disappeared. Vanished was the platform. Over time, the impact they had created diminished. What they were giving up was clear to them. They didn't come out ahead since they understood it wasn't worth maintaining. Jonathan and Susie did not have millions of dollars, contrary to popular belief. A mortgage remained outstanding. They were still owed money. There were children who needed their care. There was no undisclosed trust money or secret escape plan. Departed from Dyer with solely one another. The things they believed and the trust that God would provide for them in some way. That's why their uprising was so understated and expensive. On podcasts, they didn't air their grievances. No one was publicly criticized on social media by them. They refrained from launching a new ministry brand in an effort to attract adherents. They just withdrew, locked the door behind them, and declared, "God, we're scared, but we trust you more than the system we left." And then the true test started. In the absence of Dyer's framework, they were forced to begin anew due to a lack of prestige and financial support. However, they were constructing something new this time. No name recognition, no lasting impact, simply a life of humble, submissive faith. It lacked glitz. It failed to impress. The experience was honest, unfiltered, passionate, and unfiltered. According to what Susie stated once, peace isn't just the lack of conflict. It's having a goal in the midst of chaos. They walked into precisely that. A fresh start that was characterized by candor rather than praise or safety. In relation to alignment, even though they were still confused, they were confident in their choice. Rather than using words, their defiant actions spoke volumes. This showed the world that having power isn't all that matters. That truth-based living is superior to performance-based ministry. The decision to walk away isn't necessarily a sign of failure. There are moments when it's the most loyal action you can take. Both Jonathan and Susie had the option to remain. They might have gotten the money and grinned for the cameras. Nobody would have held it against them if they had clung to the monarchy and safeguarded the reputation. It was the most convenient and easy option. But they opted for something more challenging, something more sacred. Their decision to depart was not based on a lack of passion for the purpose, but because they were unable to adapt to the new objective. It isn't merely the things they lost that give their story its impact. That's the alternative they went with. Silence triumphed over self-promotion, conviction triumphed over convenience, and tranquility was their choice. They demonstrated that being a leader doesn't necessarily require public speaking. At other times, it entails stepping off of it fearlessly, submissively. No doors were slammed. They failed to spark a revolution. They chose not to take a stand by launching a campaign. I just saw them go. It takes a lot of courage and grace to quietly rebel in a world where everyone is so focused on their public persona. Yet its strength lies in just that quality. They gave it their all and didn't look back with regret. Their decision was misunderstood by others. Even now, there are some who decline. However, Jonathan and Susie are aware of the costs and benefits. Their future, their religion, and the peace of their children were spared, and their motivation, that ultimately was more valuable than a wage. The Lambs appeared to be the epitome of affluence from the outside. The Dastyar network was a global Christian media conglomerate worth over $1 billion. These studios were first class. Thanks to the refined production values, the site was able to reach millions of users. The stage, the lights, and the cameras. The overall effect was as if this were not merely a ministry, but rather a prosperous and strong empire. People also assumed things about Jonathan and Susie Lamb based on what they saw on screen. The public viewed the Lambs as members of a wealthy ministry dynasty due to their luxury clothing, charisma on stage, and last name. However, there was an entirely different reality lurking beneath the surface, and the majority of individuals were blind to it. That urban legend weighed heavily on Jonathan and Susie for a long time. Everyone thought they'd live the high life. As far as anyone could tell, the Lambs were living the high life, what with their own jets, mountain mansions, and fleets of luxury cars. Comfort. That impression, however, was drastically inaccurate, and nobody saw it coming. Unexpectedly, the truth was less complicated, more chaotic, and surprisingly accessible. Jonathan and Susie were much like any other young couple for the majority of their ministry life. Creating a budget, paying off debt, and providing for a family while relying on God for provision. They went through times of severe financial stress and months of uncertainty about the future. They were merely attempting to pay the bills as onlookers fantasized about riches and luxury. For a while there, Susie's income was lower than that of a person working a full-time job at a coffee shop. Still, she never stopped serving, never stopped turning up, and never stopped dedicating herself to the ministry. They were silent. Status wasn't what they were after. They were sincerely committed to their work. Without ever wanting more, Susie devoted herself fully to raising their children, caring for her family, and serving in the ministry. Even while he spoke, led, and did everything he could to carry on his father's legacy, Jonathan secretly wondered if anyone truly appreciated his efforts, comprehended the financial and spiritual strain they were wearing. Things began to appear more steady for them after Marcus Lamb passed away. Vice president was appointed to Jonathan. A considerable increase was made to Susie's salary. After a long period of time, with enough money, they could breathe easy. They wouldn't have any trouble paying their expenses. They might start to enjoy life a bit more, tend to their family, and enter a new phase of stability. But that, too, was short-lived. Revenue vanished into thin air the second they decided to cut ties with Dastyar. No separation agreement, safety net, or savings account containing millions of dollars belonged to the ministry. Their faith remained unshaken, but their financial situation was left uncertain. They were still responsible for the typical household bills, had their children, and lived in their own home. The next step was to determine how to pull it off without the security of a regular salary. That's when people began to see through the myth. People tend to think it's simple for ministry families to step down from platforms because they're returning to luxury and having something to fall back on, which Jonathan and Susie were not. They were able to rely on one another, their beliefs, and their religion. We ended there. The remaining details would need to be resolved on the fly. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that their emotions were strong. People continued to perceive them as wealthy even when they distanced themselves. The story of the wealthy ministerial family was difficult to dispel. A lot of people had no idea that behind closed doors they were having tough talks about selling their house, reduction in force. No one saw the budgeting meetings, spreadsheets, or hushed prayers to God for a miracle. The stage was all they could see. That platform had deceived them. An extremely potent aspect of Jonathan and their candor about everything is exemplified by Suze's story. No effort was made to conceal it or shield their reputation. During interviews, they expressed their fear. Concerning the future, they acknowledged being unsure. During their conversation, forthrightly discussing the monetary and emotional toll that leaving will take. Honesty and sincerity only. They damaged a crucial component as a result of their actions. They dispelled the myth that prosperity is necessarily a sign of blessing. For a minister to be successful signifies a plethora of wealth. That the performers on stage are living it up in the lap of luxury because there are cameras and lights shining down on them. Sincerity was valued, thus they revealed the truth by drawing back the curtain. Given that the legend has created harm, a lot of individuals had felt hurt by the perception that ministry is all about money. It had set expectations that were too high. It had made regular Christians feel that their faith-based lives weren't special enough. Featured caused suspicion to flourish and enraged envy. It equated God's provision with monetary achievement. Even without a platform, a wage, or a camera, those who were trying to serve God were damaged by the misunderstanding. That narrative was turned on its head by Jonathan and Susie. They served as a reminder that appearing successful isn't the point of ministry. Being faithful is the key. Being devoted sometimes requires giving up material possessions, social status, and even the spotlight. Restarting one's life from scratch sometimes requires nothing more than a humble trust in God. They went ahead and did it. Forwent introducing a new brand in an effort to sustain revenue. They passed up a golden opportunity. Without feeling any pressure to perform, they simply decided to live a new way, one that was simple, honest, and faithful. They prioritized their family. After letting go of the false belief that a life of luxury was a prerequisite for ministry, they prioritized finding inner peace. It was difficult. Doubts plagued them. Dread was upon them. Meanwhile, they uncovered something that had been eluding them. Freedom. A release from preconceived notions. Away from the picture. Embrace the freedom that comes with not having to pretend that everything was perfect. They found a new type of blessing in their newfound independence. An irreplaceable one. That being said, Jonathan and Susie Lamb did not leave wealthy, but they were completely intact. They left with calm spirits, cleansed hands, and a sense of inner tranquility. That kind of wealth is quite rare in today's world. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that according to God, success isn't measured by money, platforms, or figures. Obedience is the key. What matters most is standing firm in your beliefs and telling the truth, no matter the cost. Simply put, no matter how loud the myth becomes, the reality always wins out. Furthermore, Jonathan and Susie opted for honesty. To the average person, leadership appears to be a quest for greater heights. When you put in the time and effort, you'll earn respect and finally reach the top. In business, in church, and in life, that is the model that is taught to us. Progress is directly proportional to one's level of success. The Lambs are a world-renowned family with a billion-dollar ministry empire already established for them. Leadership doesn't just seem conceivable, it looks inevitable when you come from such a family. The plan all along was for Jonathan Lamb to become a legend. Oh my goodness! Plan. He possessed the surname, the charisma, the wisdom, and above all, the favor. Dastyar had been constructed by his father, Marcus Lamb, from scratch. From humble beginnings, he built a worldwide Christian media empire. Everyone anticipated that Jonathan would continue with it. He did this for some time. He demonstrated leadership abilities while working inside Dastyar, taking on significant responsibilities and constantly showing up. After Marcus's death, Jonathan's accession to the throne looked natural. Leaders, however, weren't concerns taking the lead. Descending is sometimes the key. It is for this reason why the tale of Jonathan and Susie is so surprising. Everything was set up for them. The platform, the clout, the money, and the admiration. Their entire achieved after years of hard work. However, they chose to let it go rather than strive for more. Nothing happened in a single day. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, and there was no scandal or betrayal that made headlines. It took place when nobody was around, during times of quiet contemplation, prayer, and late-night discourse. It started to sink in for Jonathan that leading day would need him to give up some of his core values. A sense of urgency to deliver was there. He felt pressured to keep quiet about things that bothered him spiritually and his public persona, and Susie shared that sentiment. The burden it placed on their family, their children, and their tranquility extended beyond mere meetings and decisions. Leadership is sometimes conflated with position, but as Jonathan and Susie rose through the ranks, they began to wonder, is this what real leadership is supposed to feel like? It wasn't that they lacked faith in the objective, rather, they perceived a lack of alignment. The execution style was no longer recognizable to them. Purpose has been supplanted by power. The realm of politics seeped into it. Image was the deciding factor, not integrity. And a crucial thing dawned on them. A person's calling has nothing to do with whether or not they are given authority. They might have remained. They might have retained the title, reaped the benefits of their authority, and sought to effect change. To the very top. The vast majority of individuals probably would have bought it. Aside from being financially stable, it was also safer and more respected. However, they secretly understood that remaining would have required performance, and they were sick of performing. One of their goals was to avoid taking the lead. Anything that was completely at odds with their own identity. They were embarrassed for their children to see them shine in public while they floundered at home. So they didn't go off in a huff or to make a statement. Coming away from it, they were humble, at peace, and had a painful clarity of mind. The decision to step down rather than rise reshaped leadership. Keeping one's position of power isn't what makes a leader truly effective. Being able to let go is key. It comes down to the question of which is more important: popularity or alignment, praise or... The solution seemed obvious to Jonathan and Susie. Instead of remaining in a role that didn't reflect their genuine self, they would choose to stand firm on their beliefs. They are an outlier in a culture that values prominence, celebrity, and power. We tend to elevate leaders who are commanding, well-spoken, and influential in church circles. However, perhaps our true need is for leaders who are unassuming, truthful, and courageous enough to flee when things become wrong. Leaving to establish their own empire wasn't Jonathan and Susie's plan. Instead of depart to start a rival ministry, or seek out a different limelight. They just went in a different direction in life. Living a life of religion away from the spotlight, a life of service away from the title. They prioritized family above stardom, harmony over efficiency, and authenticity over conformity. The world seldom encounters such exceptional leadership. Although it lacks attention-grabbing elements like hashtags and headlines, it is enduring. The kind that motivates others by being honest and trustworthy rather than by using their position of authority. Indeed, that may be the essence of true leadership from the very beginning.